So, as we always do, I will start with my part of the introduction and welcoming guests. Then Brother Martin will do his part. Then we will have up to 1 hour, more or less, the lecture delivered by Brother David, and then we will have Q&A session. But as there is a very local or national festival for children in UK right now, we'll try to keep to maximum of 2 hours, maybe 1 hour and 50 minutes. We'll see the dynamics of the Q&A session to give Brother David's children opportunity to enjoy the very loud festival today. So, Brother David, as soon as we'll be getting to the end, we'll try to set you free as soon as you are done with the lecture and Q&A. So, with that, I will start the lecture. So, Gamar Juvat, that is hello, my native Georgian. Welcome to Legere Aude number 5. The topic of today's discussion is the Rite of 7 Degrees. That will be delivered by Brother Dr. David Harrison. And I will remind what Legere Aude is. That is a mutual project of Lewis Masonic and Sapere Aude. And we called it Legere Aude, which in Latin means dare to read. So aiming at spreading the light further around the world and promoting acquisition of gnosis through dedicated reading, Sapere Aude and Lewis Masonic, under the mutual initiative Legere Aude, that is dare to read, have the honor to host Brother Dr. David Harrison, who is a UK-based Masonic historian and has written many best-selling books on the history of English Freemasonry. He has contributed articles on the subject to various magazines which deal with the topic of Freemasonry around the world, such as the UK-based Freemasonry Today, MQ magazine, The Square, the US-based Knight Templar magazine, Philalephs, and the Australian-based New Dawn magazine. Brother Harrison has also appeared on TV and radio discussing his works. Later on, I will share several links to his academic or professional websites that you can enjoy more of the details from his current works or the works he has accomplished previously. Regarding the topic and the book, Brother Martin will have the opportunity to introduce, and I will use briefly this opportunity to remind everyone participating today that Legere Aude has very few rules that we have to follow. That is that we don't discuss interjurisdictional issues. We don't discuss politics and religion for political or religious purposes. And here on Legere Aude, we come as like-minded individuals from around the world. The event is public, so it welcomes members and non-members, male and female, every single one who wants to learn more about the great works that has been published through Louis Masonics, the authors that we have the honor to host. Everyone's welcome to question and challenge any statements in the book or get to know the books that have been recently published, as we will have the opportunity to learn today. So, having those very simple rules in mind, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Brother Martin.
Thank you very much, David. So, we're all here to learn about the Rite of the 7 Degrees. Here's the book that this lecture is about and indeed launching. So there are many reasons why someone would find this book interesting. The whole tale of Pierre Lambert de Lintot and his Rite and the exciting time in the Enlightenment in London that it existed, that tale itself is fascinating. And I'm sure there are many people here who are interested in some of the rites that were part of his 7-degree system. Maybe you're a member of Rose Choir, or maybe you've studied the Knights Templar or part of that order. Maybe you want to see some earlier version of the Royal Arch. Or perhaps you're interested in seeing some of the new degrees, or degrees which don't seem to be worked or commonly known now, which are included in the book. Many people will be interested in the book just because of the author, whose enthusiasm is contagious, something that I think you'll find as soon as he starts speaking. You can go into a talk that he's giving and think, well, I'm here to hear about this subject. It's not really my thing. But by the end of it, you do find yourself convinced it definitely is your thing, and it always has been. But I'd like to tell you why I'm excited about this book. This is publisher's privilege here. What is it for me that's really interesting? By reading this, you get to look through a little window into Freemasonry at that time and learn how a practitioner, how a master of the art, as it were, viewed the rituals that are still practiced now. By looking at his engravings, reading the minute books, looking at the rituals in their forms, reading the history, you discover what an 18th century Freemason thinks about Freemasonry. And to me, that's very exciting, especially as it's obvious this is a Freemason who's very philosophical and very dedicated. Now, there's lots more to it. I don't want to give a talk on David's book before he gives a talk on his book. So I'll hand over to him now so he can start to tell you this amazing adventure story from that day.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll first introduce you to, I don't know if you can see that, that's Pierre Lambert de Linton. He's, there's a story behind this sketch, because it's based on two contemporary engravings that we didn't use in the book. So there's a big story there. So if we've got time, we'll go into that. But what I want to do is give an extract, brief extract from the book, from the beginning of the book, really, that discusses the Rite of 7 Degrees and what the rite was all about, really, and then we can open it up for discussion. But it's a really fascinating rite. It's something that started about 4 years ago, and I was doing a book called The Lost Rites and Rituals of Freemasonry, and I thought it'd be great to develop this as a series, you know, because there's so much there. And I call them lost rites because, you know, there was continuity issues, some just, you know, ended during the period of the French Revolution. And one that stuck out really was the Rite of 7 Degrees, mainly because it was developed in England. Even though it was French, it developed in London in the later 18th century. So that really stuck out, and I had a great opportunity to actually see the minute book and the ritual in the United Grand Lodge of England. So it was a journey from there, really. And the original book, The Lost Rites and Rituals of Freemasonry, has now become a mere index, really, of the rest of the books that were in the series. Rediscovered Rituals, which was more about Richard Carlisle, a Masonic biography of Richard Carlisle and his manual of Freemasonry, which has a link to this as well, to the Rite of 7 Degrees. Yeah, it's a very nice little collection that are developed, and like most books, you know, there's no major plan. It just kind of goes off on its own natural course, and it's something that I'm quite proud of, really. You know, this last book, this Rite of 7 Degrees, it's turned out very well. Publisher's done a great job, and so I hope you'll be pleased with it as well. So right, I shall read an extract, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, Pierre Lambert de Lintot and the Rite of 7 Degrees. The Rite of 7 Degrees operated in London, England, during the late 18th century. And despite its rather ordinary and unpretentious name, it was a rite that presented an array of exotic high degrees and had a direct French influence. Indeed, the rite was organized and run by a French immigrant that was meticulously conducted in French. And at least in its early days, the rite became connected to the Lodge of Perfect Observance #1, a lodge that operated under the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent, a Grand Lodge formed under the initial guidance of William Preston that came under the overall sway of the Grand Lodge of All England held at York during the years of 1779 to 1789. So there we have quite a confusing link between these independent Grand Lodges, the York Grand Lodge and the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent. So, however, as we shall see, the rite was in function before this particular Grand Lodge was constituted, and its influence continued long after the Grand Lodge had come to an end. Indeed, according to Masonic historian W. Wonnacott in his article for AQC in 1928, there may be some things that point to the origin of the Baldwin Rite. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Baldwin Rite, that's still going in England to this day in the Bristol area. The Rite of 7 Degrees itself consisted of an elegant collection of high grades that Wonnacott suggested originated from the French-based chapter of Claremont, which, after an intense rivalry with an order known as the Knights of the East, a compromise was achieved and an order called Emperors of the East and West was born. A compromise that lasted a fair time, really, and obviously progressed. With the high standard of degree work and the noble sounding chivalric titles, it managed to secure ascendancy in the Grand Lodge de France in 1767. And the rite was brought over to London around this time by French soldier Pierre Lambert de Lintot. The Hawk grades attracting inquiring Freemasons who held the desire to journey down a more esoteric pathway. A number of French-speaking lodges had operated in London previously, and it didn't take long for de Lintot to acquire a lodge and create a chapter. In 1779, the Lodge of Perfect Observance #1 became one of the 3 London-based lodges that operated under the short-lived, spurious Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent, though it was the only lodge to actually work the Rite of 7 Degrees via its attached chapter. The Lodge of Perfect Observance was, on the whole, made up of Frenchmen, some having been members of some of the aforementioned French-speaking lodges that had met in London. Though, as the 1780s progressed, there were some notable English names on the membership list, as well as members from other European countries. There were also some well-known aristocratic names associated with the rite, such as the Prince of Brunswick and the Prince of Hesse-Kassel. Pierre Lambert de Lintot and his rite were given a brief mention by John Yarker in his Arcane Schools, Yarker referring to how Lambert de Lintot, who was past master of Lodge St. George of Observance, had for many years been working the 7 degree system of the French Templary of Clermont, ostensibly as an agent of Prince Charles Edward Stuart. This theory that de Lintot was a Jacobite agent had also been put forward by Arthur Edward Waite in his new Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, and has more recently been mentioned by Marcia Keith Shewshard, though no evidence has yet come to light to firmly substantiate these claims. However, as we shall see in part 3 of the work, and this is the ritual part of the work, there are references throughout the ritual of a strong Ecosse tradition. The high grades of the rite were indeed practiced for a good few years in London before the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent was formed. So let us now trace its history and examine the 3 lodges and chapter that are known to have been connected to the Rite of 7 Degrees and how they all link together. The first particular lodge is the Lodge of St. George l'Observance, number 148, which was constituted on the 16th of August, 1736, at the Sun on Fish Street Hill, and that's in London. It once had the name of St. George de Unanimité and was changed to the name St. George l'Observance in 1777. And Wanacott states how de Linto joined his lodge on the 20th of January 1779, becoming senior warden before becoming its worshipful master, serving for 5 successive years. However, as we shall see, the lodge had transitioned into the Lodge of Perfect l'Observance by the closing months of 1779, and is discussed by Wanacott after the Grand Lodge ended 10 years later. And this lodge transitioned back to the Lodge of St. George l'Observance and continued to promote the high degrees for a time. So what we have there is lodges changing name, transforming, but basically keeping the core Freemasons at the heart of that particular lodge. So indeed, the Lodge of St. George l'Observance could be found operating with a Herodom Royal Chapter of the Grand Lodge and Chapter of England south of the River Trent, under the Charter of Perfect Observance, Perfect l'Observance number 1, as indicated by the final minute entry, dated to the 26th of July, 1794. And this also appears to imply that the title of the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent was still officially being used by the members, even though it had ceased to function in 1789. So the lodge, however, can be seen as officially being erased in 1794, according to Lane's Masonic records. And de Linto died sometime in the late 1790s, possibly in 1798. So by this time, the Rite, its original former, had probably ceased working. So the next lodge of interest that is part of this group of French lodges that conducted the Rite of 7 Degrees is the Union Lodge number 270, which, according to Wanacott, was the original French lodge number 331. And it always gets confusing with these lodges with the numbers, and the numbers change and the names changes. So it can sound a bit confusing. You know, it's even worse when you're trying to research this stuff. You know, so you've got to keep in touch with the numbers and the lodge changes and things like that. So this had been constituted on the 29th of January 1765 at the Old Bell Savage in Ludgate Hill. And Wanacott goes on to say how the warrant was illegally sold to de Linto and his friends in 1766, being renamed and renumbered, just to confuse Masonic researchers 200 years later even more. So it was this lodge that developed a chapter for the high degree work. When examining the minute, a strong relationship can be seen between the Union Lodge number 270 and the St. George de l'Observance Lodge, with numerous brethren from St. George being admitted into the high grades of the chapter that was attached to Union Lodge. So basically, we've got de Linto coming over in 1766, coming over to London from France. He obtains this legal warrant, to form this lodge, the Union Lodge, attaches a chapter to it, so he can specially have his conduct his rite of 7 degrees, and he soon gets in contact with other French lodges like the St. George Lodge, and the brethren go over and initiated into the rite that's being conducted. They go over there. So Wanacott observes that the Union Lodge then merged with the Lodge of Sludge, as indicated by a minute entry in May 1778. So they were probably visiting each other's lodges that much that they probably thought, well, let's get together, you know, let's merge both lodges. So although the chapter still worked the high degrees, this was now connected to the new lodge, which was the St. George's Lodge. Just to add a little more confusion for Masonic historians. So it was this alliance of the Lodge St. George de l'Observance and its new chapter that came from the Union Lodge that transitioned into the Lodge of Perfect l'Observance the following year. And thus we have a rather fluid and extremely flexible structure of lodges that merge and transmute to suit the needs of the brethren. So now we come to this third lodge that practiced the Rite of 7 Degrees. If I've not confused you so far, then this part certainly will. So the Lodge of Perfect l'Observance #1 was constituted at the Mitre Tavern in Fleet Street on the 15th of November 1779 and became the only lodge and chapter under the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent to practice the Rite of 7 Degrees. And there is a minute entry dated the 15th of September 1779 which describes this transition. And this minute entry came from the minutes that were transcribed from the Minute and Ritual book. And the chapter of Herodom, in union with the Lodge St. George l'Observance, makes alliance with the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent and receives charter at the hands of Frere Wilson for the Grand Master, Lambert de Linton, this year Master, under the title of Perfect l'Observance #1. So what's interesting there as well, just going back a little, is that they met at the Mitre, and I don't know if anyone here has done any history reading about the Enlightenment in London. The Mitre Tavern was quite a centre to the Enlightenment as such, because we have various writers and poets visiting the Mitre, and I do mention this in the book as well. Samuel Johnson, Boswell, and Oliver Goldsmith, many others that were linked to the Johnson Circle. So it's a real kind of centre, a tavern where these literary gentlemen would go to meet each other and discuss poetry and discuss you know, the news of the day, the philosophy. So it would have been a fantastic place, really, fantastic little tavern. And it was also the centre for some talks that William Preston gave. And William Preston, of course, was the leader of the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent. So going back to the entry, this entry clearly indicates that the Lodge St. George l'Observance and its associated chapter, which was originally attached to the aforementioned Union Lodge, became the Lodge of Perfect l'Observance, a brand new lodge under the new Grand Lodge. Indeed, the Rite flourished within this new context, and according to the minutes, the Rite was extremely popular, attracting Freemasons from both the moderns and the ancients, as well as Masons from Ireland and from various European countries. And we've got to remind ourselves at this particular time, there was 4 Grand Lodges operating in England. We had the moderns, the ancients, the York Grand Lodge, and of course, this brand new Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England, south of the River Trent. So, as we have seen, a fresh examination of the minutes reveals that the lodge, using the old name of St. George l'Observance and working with the Herodom chapter under the charter of Perfect l'Observance #1, continued well into the 1790s, the last minute entry being 1794. So this last minute entry also signifies that the lodge was still using the original charter of the Perfect l'Observance, and was effectively operating not only as an independent lodge, but was keeping the name of the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent alive, at least for a few more years after its demise. So we'll now have a look at some of the degrees that were part of the Rite of 7 Degrees. Wonnacott named the individual 7 degrees that were practiced in the chapter that was attached to the Union Lodge, the Lodge of St. George, and the Lodge of Perfect Law Observance. And these have some similarities to the Rite of Baldwin, and are presented as thus. The first 3 degrees are the 3 craft degrees. The 4th degree is given the name of Elu, which included a selection of unnumbered grades, including architect, prévôt et judge, grand architect, compagnon de l'arche royale, grand élu, sublime maître, and the final grade of perfect écosse. And the 5th degree was called Chevalier de Orient de Occident, and the 6th degree Chevalier de l'Eagle, Pelican, Rose Croix, de Saint-André, de Haradum, Triple Croix, or in short, Chevalier Rose Croix. The 7th and final degree is listed as Kadosh, and as we shall see in part 3 of the work, which is obviously the transcribed ritual, there is a large section of ritual entitled Chevalier, which appears to encompass a number of the Chevalier grades. And Wonnacott also noted how the Templar series were combined with the Kadosh. So what's happening there is that what Delinto has done is basically compacted most of the Chevalier grades or degrees together. And as you'll see in the ritual section of the book, it's basically one long kind of episode, really, and it's a fascinating read. You know, if you're really into ritual, and if you're into the transformation of ritual as well, you can see how Delinto really worked his ceremonies and the themes that are entwined there. Absolutely fascinating. And the way he kind of condensed things as well, because obviously what Delinto's doing, he's doing it his way. So he's actually moved on from how it was performed in France, and the rite progresses and transforms. And it's quite fascinating to see, because there you can actually see things moving along and transforming and transmuting, which is brilliant, really. You know, it's if you're into the evolution of ritual and the evolution of rites in this period, you can actually see how things change and how the language changes as well. So it's a fascinating ritual to examine, really. So there is another list of degrees given by Delinto in correspondence to the Royal Order of Scotland in 1782, transcribed by G.S. Draffen in his paper for AQC in 1955. And this differs slightly to the degrees that Wonnacott put forward and are presented in a different way. And again, this is what I was mentioning before, the progression is fascinating here. I'd just like to say as well, Draffen and Wonnacott were the original researchers that wrote papers on this, on the Rite of 7 Degrees for AQC. Wonnacott in 1928 and Draffen, as I just mentioned, in 1955. So it is quite a long time ago that this has been fully tackled. And those two scholars did fantastic papers, and if you've not read them, it's worth checking them. I believe you can get the free papers downloaded from the AQC website, which is very interesting. So it's definitely worth a look as well. Right, so I will now list another variation of these 7 degrees. And what was happening here as well was that the grades are being compacted into 1 degree. So there's a number of grades within one degree, which again can be quite confusing. So for the 1st degree, we have the entered apprentice, the Fellowcraft, and the Symbolic Master. The second degree, we have what's called the Little Elected, the Inconu, and the Elected 15. I'm sure my pronunciation is tripped up there, but you get the picture. The third degree is Architect, Judge, and Grand Architect. And the fourth degree is the Royal Arch. And the fifth degree is Knights of the East and Princes of Jerusalem. And the sixth degree is a Herodom degree, a Templar degree, and the Rose Croix degree. And the seventh degree is Kadosh and Templar. So you can see how these degrees are being interpreted, and they're progressing a bit. Just a little bit about the Royal Order of Scotland. What Delinto was doing there was obviously getting himself another charter, and he was successful at it as well. He managed to get a charter from the Royal Order of Scotland. So he had two charters. He had one from the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent, and another charter from the Royal Order of Scotland, which was quite canny of him, really. So he's obviously looking at charters. It's again the politics of recognition, and he wanted his right to be recognised, and he wanted his Freemasonry to be taken seriously. So he was looking at different ways there of how to survive. He obviously thought as well that the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent might implode or might collapse, because at the end of the day there was only 3 lodges attached to it. So it was only a very small Grand Lodge that was working in London. So certainly the journey presented by the Rite has similarities to the Masonic journey displayed in the Rite of Strict Observance, a 7-degree Rite that was also Templar orientated and had Scottish themes. Indeed, similarities can also be observed with the Melissino Rite, especially in the 7-degree pathway structure and with the occurrence of the Scottish Master Grade. Both of these rites operated on the continent during the 18th century and reveal the importance of the use of 7 degrees in conveying the Masonic story. And they certainly form part of a wider family tree of 7-degree rites from that period. The 7 degrees of Delinto's Rite was structured as having a number of grades compacted into a degree, and the 7 degrees themselves were also divided up into 3 sections. The first being the light of the law of Moses, comprising the first 5 degrees of the Rite, and the second section being the second light upon the law of Christ, which consisted of the 6th degree, and the third and final section being the light upon nature, which contained the 7th and ultimate degree. The first section, the light of the law of Moses, begins with what we recognize as the first 3 craft degrees, which were classed as 1 complete degree in the Rite. Delinto wrote that this degree revealed the signs and symbols, sacred words and passwords. The second degree of the Rite is listed as revealing the murderers of the Master, telling of their punishment and the burial of Hiram. As the Masonic story continues, the 3rd degree has the architects eating a portion of the heart of Hiram as ordered from Solomon himself, something which is reminiscent of symbolically eating the flesh of Christ. But also signifies how the old master lives on within the new. The judges and provost are also elected to prevent future discord during the perfection of the temple. The 4th degree is that of the Royal Arch, where the name of God is discovered, which is followed by the 5th degree being Knights of the East. Here we have the reconstruction of the temple after 70 years of captivity, led by Zerubbabel, and the deliverance of the Jewish people by Cyrus. The next section, entitled Second Light Upon the Law of Christ, begins with the 6th degree, which Delinto names as the Royal Order of Herodom in his letter to the Royal Order of Scotland. a degree that dramatically takes us into the Crusades of the Holy Land. And the letter also mentions the voyage of the 3 columns of faith, hope, and charity, along with research of the word lost by the death of Christ, the descent into the limbs or hell, the delivering of the souls, his resurrection, and the word being found again. And Delinto describes the 9 crusades. He introduces Geoffrey of Bouillon to the ritual narrative and mentions the antique Lodge of Scotland, and which was established in the castle of Herod, which, as Delinto states, took on several names according to the Revolution and Wars. This section, as the title suggests, focuses on Christ's death and his resurrection, and also how the word was lost and found again. And in essence, like Hiram in the previous section, the second segment covers the death of Christ, the Master. Parallels can certainly be seen here, especially with the word being lost and found, and in the eating of a portion of the heart of Hiram by the new Master in the architect's degree, which reminds us of the never-ending cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The third and final section, entitled Light Upon Nature, concludes the rite with the final 7th degree, and Delinto mentions 7 sections, 7 sacred words, and 7 seals in books of masons. The letter refers to this degree as the Royal Order of Templars Kadosh, and Godfrey of Bouillon is again brought into the ritual narrative as King of Jerusalem. Jacques de Molay is featured, and the Master's cruel death is firmly blamed on Pope Clement, with Delinto unwilling to displease the King of France for his death. In fact, Delinto goes further and states that the popes have never been assisted by the Holy Ghost, which certainly produces an anti-Catholic stance for the rite. The Masonic stories continues by saying that upon destruction of the Templar Order in the year 1312 and 1314, the Knights Templar took refuge in Scotland, so the secret knowledge thus survived. This knowledge seemed to have included the knowledge of the salts of Hermes, the separation of 4 elements, the real philosophical stone of mathematics, astrology, and all the sciences.
Brother David, just a small interruption. Could you turn on the light in the room? Because the recording gets darker and darker.
Oh, right.
And it might be better for reading as well.
So, right, I will do. Yeah, the sun is going down.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Ah, there you are.
How's that?
That's great. Much better. Now we see you.
Yeah, I'm in my attic study, so yeah, I do. I'm sat right underneath a skylight, so I'm kind of getting a bit of light, but it was.
I think he's destroyed your mood lighting now.
The mood lighting.
Yeah, it was all very mysterious and 18th century enlightenment, but now David's just. There we go. Anyway, we'll let you carry on now.
It was going a bit spooky in the attic, right? So, so basically, that describes the 3 sections to this rite. So what's happening there? Delinto is not only having a 7-degree rite, but he's embellishing it with and splitting it up into different parts that go deeper. So he's working on different levels, really. You know, he's working on philosophical levels here for each part of the ritual, which is fascinating. He's giving it a Christian overtone, and he's assessing with this that there are 3 masters that are ultimately sacrificed within this journey of these 7 degrees. First, we have Hiram, who's obviously sacrificed in the temple. We have Christ, who is sacrificed as well, and we have Jacques de Molay. So, and he puts forward that these 3 masters are essential to the Masonic story. So it's a fascinating rite that works at various different levels philosophical levels, religious levels, and it's obviously a journey that he's shaped in a way to reflect this, and it's fascinating. Plus, it's got this overlying kind of theme of the politics of the later 18th century. Lintel being French, obviously we're on the cusp of the French Revolution, you know, by this particular time. So there's some political overtones as well, which I believe Pierre Mollier has written about in some of his papers. So it'd be good for you to check out some of his papers as well. Right. On top of that, you get this fantastic legend of the how the Templars took refuge in Scotland. So the secret knowledge thus survived. The knowledge seemed to have included the knowledge of the salts of Hermes, separation of the four elements, the real philosophical stone of mathematics, astrology, and all sciences. And there is also a strange mention of the Lodge of Cromwell, which fascinated me. I've been trying to find out more about that and more about Cromwell's image in relation to you know, that age of revolution, which is a fascinating image, you know, to be tied into that age. So this completes the Masonic story held within de Lintel's Rite, a story that comprises a mystical journey and tells of the continuation of sacred knowledge that is passed down through the ages and is only given to the initiated. Wonnacott did remark that there were variants, and of course, as I mentioned before, you can see how this Rite of 7 Degrees has progressed in the language used in the minutes, and also the way that the ritual kind of moves along, you know, throughout the ages, throughout de Lintel's period of time. And there is a slight different variation of the rite that exists in the Grand Lodge of Ireland in the archives. And just to round off, I'll mention about this rite that is listed in the Grand Lodge of Ireland. The first degree is the first 3 craft degrees. The second degree is the Petit Elu, the Inconu, or the Elu Inconio again, Elo de Quins. The third degree is Architect, Prévôt, Judge, and Grand Architect. And the fourth degree is the Royal Arch. And the fifth degree is the Knight of the East, the Grand Commander, and the Prince of Jerusalem. And the sixth degree is the Knight of the Eagle, Rose Croix. The seventh degree, and this is one of those that's quite compact again, it's compacting a lot in there. It's the Knights of the East and West, the Knights of the Triple Croix, Knights of Palestine, Templars, Knights of the Sun, the Physical, Philosophical and Moral College of Herodom, otherwise called Kadosh, and otherwise known as the Knight of the Black Eagle. So there's a lot crushed into that seventh degree there. So there's definitely a change going on. There's in the language as well, the language that's used. And I can see this with rituals that transplant themselves in other countries, and like, for example, the Rite of 7 Degrees also got transplanted in Russia, and that's a whole another story that I believe a Russian Masonic scholar is getting involved with, and he's written a paper on that as well. So there's some fascinating metamorphoses going on here, you know, with these rituals. So thank you very much for listening to that extract. I hope I've not confused you, because obviously that's just taken from part of the book, and to put it into context, things would obviously smooth over, and obviously there's references. There's so many references there as well, end notes, a big section of end notes in the book. But yeah, I'm very, very proud of the book as well. It's about 4 years in the making, and it was transcribed and translated by a French friend of mine who's a French Freemason. The writing of the document is terrible, and indeed Wonnacott makes note of that as well. He actually makes note in 1928 in his paper how bad the document is, and it's full of splodges, ink splodges, stains. The writing's very, very compact. Loads of crossings out in there. So it is quite hard. There's faded ink as well, and I photographed it twice, believe it or not, to try and get as close as possible to, you know, so we could find these tricky words but yeah, it's been a fascinating piece of research, fascinating journey to go on, fascinating insight into the Rite of 7 Degrees as well, into this late 18th century ritual. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I'll turn it over to our hosts for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. That was superb to hear.
Thank you.
So it's time for questions, and with my co-host's permission, I'll start with my own questions. This is always a very interesting part. So David, my first question is speculative, but I hope you'll find it intriguing. One of the things I love about this book is the pictures of the different engravings. I actually saw these engravings in the United Grand Lodge of England and completely mistook what they were many years ago. But now I can see them and I can see your description. And I find myself starting to wonder about what they were doing based on what's in these different engravings. To me, there is an implication that aside from the ritual, there is some form of educational syllabus. Within the engravings, it's clear that they're talking about learning different skills, learning about harmonies, learning about drawing lines, learning about maths, learning about other things. The teachings of the Salt of Hermes, or the natural philosopher's stone, the moral philosopher's stone, and the spiritual philosopher's stone. Now, obviously, we know William Preston was a big influence, and he most certainly was putting together a syllabus, a question-answer style set of lectures. But we also know that other rites and degrees of the time had their own educational syllabus. We know that Cagliostro's rites certainly had teachings that you'd learn between rituals. And I can't think of any other explanation as to why, if you look in the rituals, they don't teach the things that are implied in the engravings. So I'm asking you, could there be an educational syllabus we don't know? Are there any hints of this? What studies do you think they were undertaking? What are your thoughts on this suggestion?
Well, it's interesting because De Linto referred to his rite as a college, and to him, it was a place of learning. It was a place of not just learning the degrees and not just being able to, you know, to verbally repeat them, you know, in future lodge meetings, but it was down as a college. He did refer to it as a college, and that idea was actually taken over to Ireland as well, to Dublin, where there was a couple of Irish Freemasons that went to London to go through these degrees, and then they took them back to Dublin to create their own chapters, and so that's the first occurrence of the Rose Croix and the Kadosh and those other degrees in Dublin. And so they also gave it the name college as well. So, and that got embedded, you know, within that kind of Irish Masonic culture, you know, for a number of decades, going into the you know, the early 19th century. So there was an element of continuity there as well, you know, with the Rite of Seven Degrees. So it's as if the Linto is, or was, giving these lectures as well, giving these Freemasons instruction, and they were going off to different corners of the world. We know that it got transplanted in Russia, in Dublin. We have this big question as well about the Rite of Baldwin, which has some startling similarities. Even Wonnacott saw that, you know, back in 1928. You know, he saw that there was striking similarities there between the two. So it appears that Delinto was teaching as well. So yeah, I can see that. And his engravings as well were, I mean, they're fascinating. These engravings, the geometrical symbolism, the almost pseudo-religious symbolism. Absolutely fascinating stuff. You know, it really gives like an esoteric window into what he was doing. So yeah, certainly, definitely, yeah. I mean, we know that Cagliostro was doing it as well, with the Eloquer, you know, Pasquale was giving teachings, and Willimos was going home practicing magic, basically, you know. So it's fascinating that there was this kind of underlying educational aspect to these old rites, you know. It's,
yes, I very much get the feeling that each one of these rites was a starting pistol on your own explorations and on teachings from people there, rather than the whole path in and of themselves. It was to inspire you to get going and to start listening to those who knew a lot. Okay, so my next question. There's also a very mysterious reference there to the Cromwell Lodge.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this. This is an intriguing idea, and I'm not sure if everyone here has heard about this. Obviously, it's in the Genesis of Freemasonry. If you've read that book, you'll know more about the Cromwell Lodge. But David, just briefly explain a little bit about this legend.
Well, with Oliver Cromwell, it was I think it was during the in the Netherlands, there was a revolution there around that kind of area in the 1740s, I think it was, and they were using propaganda which featured Oliver Cromwell. So Oliver Cromwell started kind of filtering into this propaganda of revolution. So of course, by the time we get to the Linto, which is wasn't too far away from that, you know, the 1760s, the 1770s, 1780s, there's this mysterious reference that we have in the letter from Delinto to the Royal Order of Scotland about the Cromwell Lodge. And in Warrington, where I'm from, there's so many legends about Oliver Cromwell, because he was here fighting a battle in 1648. Actually, in the village where I live, he fought a battle there against the Scots. And there's all these mysterious legends about Oliver Cromwell, kind of, you know, having tunnels, secret tunnels. He stayed in this particular cottage in Warrington, and growing up around Warrington, you know, you kind of hear these legends all the time. Oh, there's tunnels going off, and, you know, things of this nature. So it was always linked to, you know, kind of meeting secretly and things like that, and obviously revolution. And so I think what's happened there is that this Cromwell Lodge has been drawn into this kind of legendary status that's embedded in the Rite of Seven Degrees, you know. So he's kind of drawn on that, and he seems to be feeding off these legends that can help his rite to develop, and the themes, building up on the themes, you know, because I mentioned before how it changes all the time. So for a Frenchman to come over to London in the 1760s and to kind of try to add a bit of English stuff in there as well, you know, that's tainted with the revolution and tainted with this aspect of rebellion, you know, it's interesting.
Okay, now final question. We don't have all of the rituals, do we? Is that correct? There's some we're yet to find?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, the thing with the Rite of Seven Degrees as well, it's obviously changed. So what we've got in that document, in that manuscript, probably dates to around about the 1780s, maybe even 1790s, early 1790s. It's been changed a lot and been, you know, messed about with. And we find out in the minutes as well that he starts using different phrases as he gets to the later 1780s, early 1790s. He starts using different references, and so we know the ritual's changed. So what this ritual was like in the 1760s is probably, you know, it's open to speculation. It's a bit different than the ritual that's presented in the book. So yeah, there's bits missing.
There's more to be discovered.
Always more to be discovered. Always more books to be written, and
that's
more
good to
views
hear.
to be aired. Yeah.
So it's time for us let's move over to questions from guests here, and of course, as normal, we'll alternate between those who are here on video and audio who have their hands up. And then David will list the questions from in the comments, both here on Facebook and on YouTube. So Hasu, I think you've had your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. And David, very interesting. Something that I have never thought about, never read about, or never even contemplated looking for. But there we go. You open another portal into what we should always think is a never-ending story. What I find interesting is that you talk about the first thing I would want to know is, was the original ritual in French, which when it was transferred over here, translated into English? My thought is that, you know, they're always lost in translation. How much of it would have been such that you wouldn't have had the exact translation and not the same meaning to the ritual that it may have originally meant to be? And of course, the other thing would have to follow that would have been that when we moved over to the sort of standardized rituals, they took out the education bit, which again means that, you know, we just have ritual, and as Martin mentioned earlier on, that, you know, it's so created, you just do the ritual and there was no education, so it was peeled away. How do you think that affected the changeover into the sort of new structured ritual that we sort of ended up with, things like emulation, which became the standard ritual?
Thank you for that. Yeah, very interesting question. Yeah, the translation. Yeah, things always get lost and muddied a bit, and we had to work on the translation a bit. It was done by a friend of mine called Thierry Bachman. He was going to join us today. I'm not sure if he's come in, but he did the bulk of the translation. He's a French Freemason who's got experience with some of the rites that are still going on in France, and so he knew the wordings and the the Masonic references, and we were working on that probably together for a good few years. It was all happening in the background while I was doing something else, and he was doing other projects. And then Pierre Mollier had a read of it, and he's a French Masonic scholar, which some of you may be familiar with. And then I got a French-speaking English Freemason called Julian Rees. Don't know if anyone
know him very well.
Rees, yeah. I mean, he is probably one of the best ritualists that I know. Really, he knows the ritual inside and out. And he's a French speaker. He goes up to France a lot, so he's used to French culture, and so he had a read of it and was picking out mistakes and things like that, because he was coming from an English perspective,
yeah.
You know, and so we had quite a few people working on it as well. I was reading in the book, because you get jaded by it, really. You get you know, after a few years of doing it, you get fed up of doing it, because you're always nitpicking it and you're always seeing mistakes. And I was reading it this morning, actually, and I picked up on something. I thought, oh God, you know, that needs to be changed, you know. So even today, you know, there's still little bits in there that need to be addressed, but that's for a second edition. But,
don't do this to me, David.
just little things, little tiny things. But yeah, to answer your question, yeah, things do change slightly. So that's why we thought we'd keep in the actual ritual section, which is part 3. Part 1 basically talks about the history. Part 2 looks at his engravings, and part 3 is the transcribed section of the minutes and the ritual. So what we decided to do was to do 1 page in the French and 1 page in English, and we carried on like that throughout part 3. So one of the tasks really was to balance the text as well. Mm-hmm. So we had to bear in mind the aesthetic of the presentation, and we worked with Martin and one of the designers as well. And I think we were on this for a few months, weren't we? We were doing this for a good few months just to get the layout right, so the presentation was right. So it really was a lot of work as well. And I let a few other people look at it and get their criticisms back as well. And we just did our best with it, really. We just did the best that we possibly could. But yeah, very, very pleased with it. As I say, I've been reading it and still get the odd little word that doesn't seem right, and think, you know, could change that. But yeah, things do get lost in translation, obviously. Things do get changed, you know, which is the best way to say it in English, which might be something different than the French, you know. So
oh, well, this means that I'll have to smash the piggyback and buy the book.
Exactly.
But
you will not be disappointed, trust me. It's a big book.
Well, just for the note, there's no refunds.
Yeah,
but the other thing I was also sorry was, having gone through all this number of rituals that you have sort of gone over all your books, how easy or how difficult would you find now to create a new ritual from all those?
A new ritual? What, from the old stuff? Yeah,
all the stuff that you've been through.
Well, I mean, it's been done before, really. It's all been done before. I mean, you've got to remember that these rites, these rituals, these high degrees, they've progressed. They've all been changed, and they've, you know, been transformed. If you look at the Scottish Rite, for example, that really came from these rites. You know, there's elements in the Rite of 7 Degrees that's in the Scottish Rite. Most of these rites have lent themselves to the development of other more modern rites, other degrees. You know, the Rose Croix, Knights Templar, Knights of Malta. You know, I mentioned very early on how it connects to Richard Carlisle. and Richard Carlisle's Manual of Freemasonry, which was the content of my last book, The Rediscovered Rituals, which is part of this series. Well, with Carlisle, who was an English radical, he wasn't a Freemason. He was jailed in 1819 for saying things that he shouldn't, politically and religiously.
Yeah.
And he ended up in jail. And while he was in jail, he wrote this massive expose, which later became the Manual of Freemasonry. Within those degrees, because he didn't just concentrate on the 3 degrees, he did all these high degrees as well. And some of those high degrees are degrees that are found in the Rite of 7 Degrees, which probably faded away in the mid 1790s. Carlisle's writing in 1825. So there we've got what, about 30 years gap perhaps, and those degrees are still important enough for Carlisle to include them in his Manual of Freemasonry. So they're still going. That journey, that Masonic journey, was still going.
Well, I was going to also say that if you ever need to speak to someone who is a researcher and is in French and is a professor, Joseph Bellin, who is on the meeting today with us, he's from Brussels. So he would be able to. He's done a lot of work and research in a lot of Masonic and non-Masonic matters. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, it could have a look at that for the 2nd edition in a few years' time. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
David, would you like to do a few text questions? We have got a couple of hands up, but I think it'd be nice to alternate, as we are aware that David Harrison has got limited time tonight.
Sure, I will do that. We still got like 30 more minutes, 35 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. My
So,
daughter is kind of working about over there, but yeah, I'm good.
Sure. We'll try to focus on the questions to have as much as possible answered. So, Charles, your first question: rituals change, but did the purpose theme changed? It was partially answered, but we don't know the earlier versions, right?
The very early versions. Well, I suppose we've got to look at the chapter of Clermont, and there are some texts that were published in France around the 1760s. Art de Hoyos actually done a work on one of the texts, I believe. Morris has done some work on the other, and they do include degrees that are similar to the ones that were practiced in the Rite of 7 Degrees. So the theme is still there, really. I think the central themes stay the same, but even those get developed. They get embellished. It's always how can we do this better? And if you think about it as well, the Linto was in London in the 1760s to 1790s, during a time when we were at war. I think we were at war with France, 7 Years' War, was it? I think. And then the revolution happens. So there's always this kind of English-French antagonism. So the fact that Delinto turns up in London and he practices this Rite of 7 Degrees in French is quite special. And the fact that it changes and the fact that it develops. At the very end of the minutes, you can see they're being written in English. So they've changed from being written in French to being written in English. So that's interesting. And but the central themes always stay the same, even though they get embellished a bit. Like, for example, we mentioned that Delinto was naming certain degrees. I'll just refer back to my notes. We have let's have a look. The light of the law of Moses for the first section. The second light upon the law of Christ, and then the light upon nature. So we're getting things changed and renamed, and these biblical figures are part of these degrees, the themes of these degrees. So yeah, I think the central theme stays the same, but things get embellished and developed.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll pick the question from Caleb, which is on YouTube. We have 11, 12 viewers following the lecture. There are plenty of excellent lectures, thank yous, and things like that. So the question is, thank you for the presentation. As a point of clarity, especially for the profane, how do we commonly define a Masonic rite? What if any are the distinctions between between a rite, a pendant body, and order? That's the first question.
Yeah, well, I think that's getting a bit more within the politics of Freemasonry, really. I mean, obviously, a rite like the Rite of 7 Degrees is, I think Art de Hoyos mentioned it more elegantly. A rite is like a set of stairs going up, and so each step is a degree, and you climb those stairs and you reach to the top. You know, so that's how I would see a rite, how these degrees are put together with a theme, with a story, a Masonic story. Different, isn't it? That's more of a whole, perhaps a different theme, a different part of the story. You know, so the way that I see it is, say, for example, with Carlisle. Carlisle, his manual of Freemasonry wasn't a collection of degrees that came under a rite. It was a collection of degrees, and some of those were already being taken out to become orders at that particular time. So what we have again is a progression, a natural progression, transformation, where some of these rites, the degrees in the rites, are cherry picked. So we'll have that one sounds good, we'll take that, and then they get taken and they get developed, and that becomes part of, say, for example, the Knights Templar order, or, you know, something like that, you know, and
Okay.
the Rose Croix, you know, which is effectively in England, it's you know, part of a variation of the Scottish Rite, you know, the northern jurisdiction where that was taken over and messed about with, and so you can see how things have changed, developed, transformed, progressed, and it's all part of that progression, and that's what makes this very interesting. You know, this ritual development, and how especially high grades, you know, how they've kind of gone in very different directions and cherry picked from certain rites, and this is where we get an element of continuity, really. You know, it's not an evolutionary dead end for Delinto's rite. Parts have been cherry picked and taken elsewhere.
Okay, answers taken. Let's take another question from YouTube, and then I will return the floor to Brother Martin. The question comes from Brother Kingston Patrick. If this pre-existed the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, why would Albert Pike have needed to rehash it?
Rehash
Rehash it, yes.
a rehash.
Rehash, yeah.
Yeah.
Rehash.
Well, you've got to think of these rites as cultures, in a way, and certain rites get taken to other places or get adopted by other leaders, by other Masonic leaders. Because let's face it, these leaders like Pierre Lambert de Lintot, he was a very astute ritualist, and he was in control of the Rite of 7 Degrees. It was his baby, really. And you can tell that from the minutes. His presence is all over it. His handwriting is there. His signatures are lavish. He was doing designing these engravings. He was the central figure of this rite. It was his rite. So this was his little thing, his little culture. And then he gets someone else who basically takes a rite and then takes that over somewhere else to another country, and that develops around his personality, and he adds different things. He cherry picks from other sources and puts them together. So this is how it develops really. Now, when we get to the when was it, the 1860s, the 1870s, when Pike was involved and basically nurturing his own culture, if you like, his own Masonic culture within the Scottish Rite. I mean, if you look at Pike as an individual, very high intellectual, an American as well. So he's coming from a different angle, and obviously a different culture. So he's transforming his own ideas into the Rite, you know. So I wouldn't really call it rehashing, but I'd call it readdressing for a different time period, and obviously an emerging culture as well. You know, so this is how ritual changes. You know, you kind of adapt it to your own time, to your own place and time. And obviously these Masonic characters, these strong, charismatic, intellectual Masonic characters that are always there in Freemasonry, because Freemasonry, when we talk about male Freemasonry, obviously, historically, these are alpha males. You know, these are guys that are not only top of their own careers, but they're the top in Freemasonry as well. You know, their own particular lodge, their own particular jurisdiction. So they have a stamp on their vision. You know, they can implant their vision into that framework. So yeah, I wouldn't call it rehashing. I'd call it readdressing, perhaps for the period that these people are operating in.
Thank you. Back to you, Brother Martin.
Thank you. One small thing I'd like to mention that might be quite interesting for those present that I've observed. One of the reasons rituals tend to get a little bit changed over the whole history of Masonry is because back in the times that this rite appeared, one of the chief practices for a Mason would be to puzzle out mysteries. And that idea of puzzling out mysteries wasn't just in Freemasonry. There were pictures you could get to contemplate on, emblems which were deliberately obscure. There were tales which had many levels to them. Puzzling things out was seen as a way of contemplating things. So rituals that are deliberately written to be a bit peculiar and mysterious and with lots of loose ends, by the time the Victorian brothers and everyone going since get to them, they're thinking, oh, there's something wrong here. They want to make them more clear and complete, and want to make them historically correct rather than this analogous. And they want an explanation that everyone can understand, and they're concerned about people being puzzled. So they subtly start to make a puzzle something easy to understand, if that makes sense. So that's one reason you do see slight changes starting to happen, and different ways of viewing things that slowly bring things into a more congruence. So anyway, enough from me. Philip, you've been waiting patiently with your hand in the air, your virtual hand in the air. Do let us know your question.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, David, for your presentation. I've also, I must say that I've also enjoyed your other book on the lost rites. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Now, to my question, you've mentioned that the Rose Croix was part of the Seven Rites, and that it later on developed into the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, what we now know, the 18 degree, right? And what I see nowadays is that when you mention in the Masonic environment Rosicrucians, everybody says, oh yes, the 18 degree. But I have a book from Andres Casart, it's written in Spanish, which is called Manual of Masonry, where he specifically says about the 18th degree that it has nothing to do with the early 17th century movement of the Rosicrucians. And when we look from the historical point of view, 18th century, we had the Order of Gold and Rosy Cross. So my question to you is, do you know whether there have been any kind of a connection between the French and their Rose Croix and the Germans and their alchemical, inventions and investigations under the Golden Rosy Cross? And why do we see this kind of confusion between Red Cross being Rose Croix on one side and Rosicrucians on the other? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. It's that is a good question, as they say, when they don't know the full answer. But it's the way that I interpret it is that the degree, the Masonic degree of Rose Croix is very, very different, really, in regards to the so-called Rosicrucians of the 1600s and 1700s, but it still retains some of those themes. The themes are still there, kind of running through it. Really, it's just been changed and adapted for Masonic to fit part of the Masonic story in there, So it's a very strange and mystical degree that emerged in the 18th century. So there's no connection between that and the Rosicrucian movement, if you like. But however, it seems to have adopted some of those themes, some of those alchemical themes, and the themes of resurrection. So it's interesting how these Freemasons again cherry-picked their source material to construct these degrees, which were basically sequels, to the Masonic story. So it still retains certain themes. But they've obviously adapted it and put it into this sequence of events. It's a bit like I think when I was giving a talk here about a year ago, maybe. I think it was on the Lost Rites, and someone put it this way: it's like Star Wars films. So you get these three films that came out from 1977 to 1983, which were basically the middle films. And then you didn't get the prequels till the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, and now we have the sequels. So the prequels should have gone before it, and the sequels after it. So it's a bit like that, really. It's like constructing a series of degrees, and to put them in some kind of meaning, some meaningful sequence. And each degree is obviously different and has a different theme. But links into the degrees, and the Rose Croix seems to have been implanted as really an essential part of this degree story, and they called it the Rose Croix, and it has all this vivid, beautiful symbolism, of the rose and the meaning of the rose, and how that signifies Christ and the resurrection, and all this kind of stuff. And then if we look at Carlisle, going back to the Manual of Freemasonry, Carlisle, Richard Carlisle, he presents two versions of that, which is quite nice, really. So already in the 1820s, there's different versions of that. So again, it depends who is behind these rites and rituals and degrees, who is in control, where they're based, which country they're based in. But generally there's no connection, between the Rosicrucians of the 1600s. It's just that elements of the stories have been moved along and embedded into that particular degree. That's the way that I see it.
May I just once again add to the observations of David there, something else interesting to do with our degrees and to do with human interaction in general. A mistaken impression, which is one which meets with approval and is inspiring, often makes it so. When the Greeks interacted with the Egyptian priests, they used to call them magos, magicians. And the Egyptian priests said, no, 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 we're not magicians, we're priests. And they held out saying that for 200 years until eventually they started calling themselves magos. When the hippie Westerners started learning yoga from India, eventually they changed what the teachers were teaching by being very excited about very new age ideas that weren't originally in the Veda or the Vedas or the teachings. And the same with the Rose Choir degree and the Rosicrucians, the similarity of the names and the excitement that they could be connected seems to have slowly connected them. I think that might be one of the things that's happened. Okay, so yes, moving next question here. Draken, is that how I pronounce your name? Let me know. You've been waiting for a while. Let's
thank you very much, Martin. Well, thank you, Brother David, for your very interesting and clear lecture. I became very interested in reading your book and knowing all those amazing degrees. Well, as you said, it was not an original idea at the time to condensate or organize all Masonic knowledge in 7 degrees. There are many continental examples, and for example, in France, you can find the system of Scottish Mother Lodge of Marseille, Saint-Jean-de-Coste, Marseille, that had 3 blue degrees and 4 high degrees, or even French Rite that has also 3 craft degrees and 4 high degrees. What I find very interesting in this system is that those French systems at that time, the last degree was always the Rose Croix, because it marked the passage from the old law to the new law by the discovery of faith, hope, and charity. At that time in France, French Rose Croix was not an alchemical degree, it was a Christian degree. The alchemical interpretations were introduced in the beginning of the 19th century. And this system includes also the Templar legend, and it goes much further, and that's really very interesting. As you said, the idea to compress the degrees, for example, the 2 degrees, we can find it also in the French Rite. All the steps of the French Rite are synthetic degrees that make the synthesis of a lot of degrees from the same family. And as I understood from what you presented, we can find in this system exactly the same kind of construction. It's not an analytical system as the Rite of Perfection or that served as source from ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, but it's a more similar construction to French Rite. So I think that it would be very interesting as further investigation. I don't know if you started already this path to try to discover from the French degrees which were the sources of these synthetic degrees. And a very interesting comparison could be to compare these synthetic degrees with the arch of the 81 degrees that comprise the French Rite and whose manuscripts are in BNF. So I think that would be a very interesting study to do. What I wanted to ask you was two questions. First, those lodges that you told, which craft degrees practice? They practice the normal modern craft degrees from the Premier Grand Lodge, or they have a particular craft degrees? And the other thing I wanted to ask you is that Union Lodge that you referred is the same lodge that in 1737, I think, worked in Devil's Tavern and had a Scotch Masters Lodge aggregated, and it's in that lodge that we can find the first traces of that degree of Scotch Masters. Is it the same lodge that after merge with St. George?
Right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. The just before I answer the questions, the or attempt to, yeah, the French Rite is something that has fascinated me with this, because going back to my friend in France, the Harry Backman, he's introduced me to various different versions of the rite, and different symbolisms that's going on there. There is in the book, there's one of the
Yes.
tracing boards, the Fellowcraft tracing boards there, the 7 steps going up there. It's beautiful. So I thought, well, that's going in there. That was from Theory Backman. And in the appendices, I have made an effort to actually put down at least some of the 7-degree rites, which I find fascinating, because I think it was Gould that tried to link up these in some kind of family tree, which was interesting. He attempted to do that. That was obviously back in the later 19th century. But I thought, well, I'll list a few of the 7-degree rites in an appendices, and give a petty history there, you know, behind them, and how there may be a connection. And in one of those, I put the traditional French Rite of 1818, which does indeed end with the Rose Croix. So yeah, that's a fascinating difference, really, because obviously with Pierre Lambert de Linto, he's using Kadosh, you know, the very end, you know, and this is his pride and joy, you know, and he mentions that in the minutes as well, you know, how important that degree is, and he is the only one, he says, that is master of this, you know. So fascinating, yeah, the differences. But yeah, the Union Lodge, going back to the Union Lodge, this was something that I was looking into, actually, because it was originally the French Lodge number 331, and it was constituted on the 29th of January 1765. So this is when, well, my daughter's shouting in the background now. She's I don't know if you can hear her. But yeah, this is when the lodge was obviously constituted, and it was at the Old Bell Savage in Ludgate Hill. So I believe that the Union Lodge that you refer to was a different lodge that was actually doing that Scots Masters degree. I have got some information on that in the notes. I was going to put some of that in there, but then I thought, well, it might be too confusing, because obviously when you get lodges that are named the same, you know, or similar, and there's different numbers, it can kind of muddy the water a bit. So I thought, well, that's a separate story, really, even though it does cross over, you know. But this particular Union Lodge was constituted in 1765, and then it was illegally sold to de Linto and his friends a year later. So and then it was renamed and renumbered. So yeah, when you start into lodges like that, it can be quite confusing, you know, when you get all these different numbers and the names change. But yeah, there's a story there, definitely, you know, with that particular Union Lodge, which is very interesting, because I think that was the 1740s, wasn't it? It was meeting in the Devil's Tavern.
Yes, I think 1737.
Yeah,
That's the time that we find traces from that Scots Master's degree that was traveled to Berlin, and then after to France. and
Yeah.
was at the origin of all the high degrees of l'écosysme.
That's
So,
right. Very, very interesting story. Yeah, because
yes,
that was the
that
origins
was
of
the
it.
first high degree of everything.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, even before the Royal Arch in a way, because the Royal Arch.
I think Royal Arch is a descendant of that Scotch master's degree.
Yeah.
The legend is very similar.
Yeah, and again, it's an example of how a degree was transplanted elsewhere, and it developed there as a different culture, in a different culture.
It was brought to Berlin by a brother, an Italian brother that was a painter called Fabris, and that Scots Masters Lodge of Berlin worked in French language and had French members. And after that Scots Masters degree went to France, and we find in 70s traces of the Scots Masters in Paris, for example.
Yeah.
So everything came from that Scots Masters degree.
That's right. Yeah, and it's interesting as well how it progressed so quickly when it was transplanted over there. Because by the time we get to the 1740s, it's really took a hold. And
because it was a very rich degree from what we know today, from its legend and its ritual. Everything passes from the story of the discovery of the right name of God in a crypt under the ruins of Solomon's temple by Scots Crusades knights. So it was a really very interesting degree, and of course Royal Arch and all those Scott Masters, the French Scots Masters degrees, they have origin in this English Scott Masters degree.
It's a great development. I know there's a couple of people working on that development now. There's
Pierre Mollier has an interesting paper about that. If you want, I can send you.
Oh, it'd be great. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. Thank you.
Okay, do we have enough time for another question or two, David?
Yeah, it's all gone quiet, so things are good, I think.
David, would you like to do some from the comments now, or should I continue with those who are holding their hands up?
Let's take the last hand, and then we will do whatever questions we will be able to do from the chat.
Wonderful. That was what I was hoping you'd say. So I've got J.V. Bevelin. Am I saying everything correct there? My dear friend, you need to take yourself off mute.
My name is Joseph van Bellingen. I'm from Belgium. I'm the one who spoke about.
Wonderful. An educated question coming here.
Thank you for this very interesting conference. And I have one question. Is there a link between the Linteau and the circle and the lodge of the Philalette in Paris with the Savalette de Lange?
The Rite of Philalethis?
Yes, Philalethis and the Savalette de Lange.
Yeah.
The convention of the Philalethis in
That's right. And that was that late 1770s or
1787 or so.
I not come across any direct link. Obviously, by that time, Pierre Lambert de Linteau was very firmly based in London. He'd been in London, since 1766, and we're basically working on the bare bones of things, really. Not that much is known about de Linteau in France. We know that he was made a Mason in the 1740s, that he was based in Normandy at some point, hence the de Linteau part of his name, because we know that previous engravings of de Linteau, he's basically referred to as P. Lambert. So, or Philippe Lambert, sorry, Pierre Lambert. So yeah, we don't really know that much about his time in France, apart from the fact that he was a soldier as well. So he's a military man. So I don't think there is a connection, because by that time he was firmly based in London, and had his own circle as well. You know, he had his own circle of followers, really. To answer the question, I don't think so, really. But you never know, something might come up where he may still be in contact with people in Paris.
And he was not in contact with Masons in Paris or France in general.
Not that I know of. There was a group of French immigrants, shall we say, that were based in London, and the ones that were Masons were obviously quite close to him. He did have a section of followers, shall we say, especially in the early days, that were French, and they'd obviously moved to London, but there doesn't seem to be any connection, really, that I've found, that he's still in touch with Freemasons in Paris. But obviously he was in touch with people around Europe, because there were people from Germany, from Russia, coming into London, and they were being initiated into his rite, shall we say. They were taking the degrees of his rite. So he was certainly well known, and there were a lot of military people coming over, and also aristocracy, you know, from various different locations in Europe. So he was obviously in touch with people, and he was well known. So people were coming to him to be initiated, to take these higher degrees that were in his rite, you know. So it was obviously in touch with people by letter. Not much has survived, though, you know, which is a shame.
Okay, David.
Okay, I'll try to ask some questions. We are almost out of time, but maybe one or two questions that we can answer, and those that will be unanswered, I'll reserve the chat, and probably we might be able to organize an hour Q&A session, maybe later, sometime in future, with Brother David, because those seem to be very interesting questions, and without lecture, just Q&A session could be a good idea to follow up this discussion, if that's okay with you, Brother David.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah. We could also
Okay.
look at other parts of the book as well, you know,
Sure.
other sections that might give light on
Excellent. So we don't want to disappoint your daughter, so maybe one or two very short questions right now, and then we'll let you go, so that can play with the daughters. One question that I have is regarding the Russians that you mentioned several times. Yelag, and I read about that in AQC report, that Yelagin and Lukin, that were both initiated in this rite. And
That's
there
right.
were Yelagin has been given the position of deputy grand master or something like that, and they then went to Russia. From Russian sources or books that I read, Yelagin has been a person in Russian Freemasonry, the very phenomenal guy.
Yeah.
So my question was, did he have any other kind of position entitled conferred to him from any Grand Lodge or of then existing in England, or was it the only position, the Deputy Grand Master, which has been conferred to him or given to him by Peter? Because in England, in Russia, Yelagin was presenting himself as the Deputy Grand Master of that has been given to him in England, but it doesn't give these details what this seems to be different Englands. Let me put it that way.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
England those days.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
what's your point on that? If you have researched that part.
Yeah, well, I do mention that in the book. I was actually going to put a print of him in the book, but I couldn't get permission to use it. The only print I had was like a small little digital thing, and I did find a larger one of him, and I couldn't get permission to actually get it in the book. But yeah, he was a central figure really. He came over and to Delinto. Obviously, he put him through the Rite, the high degrees, and then went off with this deputation really to start the Rite in Russia, which is a completely different story, a separate story, and that survived for a few years, and it changed its name. I can't remember the name now that he actually used. I do mention it in the book, I think, but he wasn't called the Rite of 7 Degrees. He actually changed it. So again, we can see how things were transforming, things were changing. So he plucked the Rite, implanted it in his native Russia, completely adapted it and changed it, and it transformed. And it lasted a few years, I believe. It lasted, you know, quite a few years, attracted quite a few high members of society, shall we say, in Russia. You know,
Yes.
so again, it was quite a famous part of Russian Masonic history, and directly linked to Delinto, really. So really, you know, Delinto, Pierre Lambert Delinto wasn't just a guy, you know, a maverick. You know, he wasn't just a guy that said, right, I'm going to do my own Rite. Let's get people involved. Let's make a bit of money. He really believed in his style of Freemasonry. He really believed in his Rite of 7 Degrees, passionately. And his ritual performance, shall we say, was so worldwide known. You know, he was quite famous in the Masonic world, and there was all these different people coming to him. You know, from Russia, from Germany, France, from Sweden, I think it was as well, from Ireland, Scotland. You know, so it was quite a central figure and very well respected. And as Martin said, you know, it was like a college. He actually named it a college. There was this, it wasn't just the ritual, go and learn that, come back and do it. You know, there was a lot tied in with it. There was education, there was philosophical things. You know, there was other, many different levels to it as well, which is absolutely fascinating. And of course, when that got implanted in Russia, it went in a different direction, you know. So yeah, it's a fascinating story.
Thank you. Last question, and as we agreed, maybe in coming days or weeks, we can find a slot when we will do the Q&A session only, and there are plenty of questions to answer, very interesting ones. The last question, while reading through the person, Pierre Lintot, from AQC report, there was this notion there that he seems to have brought the engravings from France, not really producing them in England, but bringing in from France. And he had his, I forgot the surname, his Frenchman, his friend who stayed with him in the room, and every time they needed to got the order from someone, he would kind of reshape this engraving for certain customer. So it seems that only in several cases, Peter himself was the author of, I don't know, maybe he was the author in France of those engravings he brought with him, but this is the notion that is being kind of produced in the AQC, that that was the feeling that was left. So, and the second kind of issue, most of them were military guys. They were not artists at all. They were military guys. And even the mention of the higher degree or higher ranking guys, you see the field generals, lieutenants, and quite a elite of French military present as a hierarchy of the order of the Rite of 7 degrees. So combining these two, what was the context of these French guys living in London, in the heart of London? And it wasn't kind of suburbs of the London. There was in Soho. It was right in the middle of it. Did they have any political agenda, or I wouldn't say spy, but also some influence that they wanted to kind of have on the events in London? You remember, and the notion also of the author Ikishu is that this was the Rite of Seven Rites that then turned into became part of Grand Orient of France that led to revolution. That was the sentence. So it's kind of this notion of revolution is also there, which happened a bit later, but still it was the context seems like that. So was there any political agenda in reality?
I don't think there was any political agenda. No, there was always these legends attached to Delinto about him being a Jacobite spy. And that gets picked up on in the 19th century by John Yarker, Arthur Edward Waite, and more recently, I think it's Martha Suchard, who writes about that. Well, there was no connection at all, apart from the use of the Scottish theme, you know, in the Rite, you know, where the Knights Templar go to Scotland and the Mountain of Herodom, and the Royal Order of Scotland, the application for the patent, of course. There is a quote which I'd like to read you if I can quickly find it, where Delinto in the minutes actually addresses this problem. He actually says, no, I'm not a Jacobite, and I don't have allegiance to Bonnie Prince Charlie. I have allegiance to the King of England, or the Hanoverians at least. I'm trying to find it. It is in here somewhere. And it is a fantastic quote. And I don't know where it is.
We've got to get the book to read it. So yeah, that's also a good answer.
To read it. But he does actually say that, and it's a fantastic quote. But he denies any involvement with Bonnie Prince Charlie, with the Pretender, as he calls them. Oh, I found it. Here we go. Oh no, I've lost it again. The page turned over. Right, here we go. The year of our Lord, on the 19th of June, 1774, high noon, the wise and sovereign chapter of the Knights of the Rose Croix Eagle assembled, deliberated to recognise His Royal Highness Henry Frederick, Duke of Cumberland, initiated on February the 9th, 1774. So the fact that the Duke of Cumberland had been initiated into Freemasonry, they're acknowledging that and they're discussing that. For Grand Master, Grand Curator, Guardian of the Pact and Sacred Vow of Christians, in place of Charles Edward Stuart, for the reasons that have been alleged in this chapter, and particularly that we will not recognise in this chapter no constitution in the name of the said Charles Edward, in the three kingdoms of Great Britain, that is contrary to our deliberation and to the vows that we make and we will make all our life for the prosperity of the House of Brunswick, that it will be presented in the said Duke of Cumberland at the most convenient time, and at each chapter he will be hailed as such. Glory to God, to His Highness Henry Frederick, Duke of Cumberland, to have Knights of the Eagle Rose Croix. It was deliberated the said day and year as below, by 70 in number, 70 people, 70 Masons. So there you have it. He's basically saying, oh no, we're not Jacobites, we're not into the Bonnie Prince, you know. Oh no, we're Duke of Cumberland, you know. So he's actually saying it there in the lodge, and that's got put in the minutes, so in black and white. So I think he's making a point there that no, we're not Jacobites. We may be doing rituals and degrees that echo this Scottish legend, but were not for the Bonnie Prince. And this is in 1774. So this is almost 20 years since the you know, the Battle of Culloden. Over nearly 30 years, is it? You know, it's interesting that he makes that point in 1774. So
Okay.
there you have it. So there was certainly no political agenda there in regards to Jacobites. And even though he actually mentions as well in his letter to the Royal Order of Scotland that he doesn't hold the King of France responsible for Jacques de Molay's death, he blames the Pope, you know, but he seems to hold the king in high regard, the King of France. But I don't think there was any, certainly there was no record of anyway, any kind of secret activity going on by Pierre Lambert de Linso. You know, he was too engrossed in his Freemasonry. I think he was too engrossed in his ritual, even though that has a political level in a way. You know, there is political themes going on there. I think that he was obviously too engrossed, you know, in his Freemasonry and his followers, really.
Okay, thank you so much, Brother Martin. You may want to do the closing part, then I will do my part, and let's give some freedom to Brother David. Otherwise, girls will get disappointed.
Thank you very much to the Davids, both for the talk and for helping host this. The Rite of 7 Degrees is an inspiration. It shows how Freemasonry and its kindred arts can be progressive if you choose to ensure it is so, if you keep studying and keep moving forwards. If you read the description of the engravings and the different descriptions of the ritual and even the minute books, you get that sense of striving to be the best you possibly can be and to understand things as clearly as possible. Let's take these lessons from the past and apply them to the present. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much. You've been given all the links for those who want to get the signed version of the book. You have Brother David's author's emails and Facebook page links, so you can get directly in contact with him. Otherwise, Louis Masonic has already the book available for purchase on its site. For those who've been watching it on YouTube, I will remind everyone that today we had Legere Aude, which is Dare to Read, number 5. And the topic of the discussion was the Rite of 7 Degrees, the book recently released by Brother Dr. David Harrison. Thanks for joining, and this concludes our lecture. And goodbye, and Nahwamdis, that's goodbye in my native Georgian. Today is 7th of November 2021. Thank you.